Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the session. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor, and I'm delighted to share with you the Canadian story with regard to public sector service delivery and quality and satisfaction. So let me just take a minute to tell you about the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service, who we are and what we do. First of all, we are a not-for-profit organization based in Toronto, Canada. But of course, we work with governments across Canada and in fact around the world. The Institute was created nearly 20 years ago. It was set up by government for government. So basically, our role is to be a champion for public service excellence. And we have approximately 3-4 key business lines or activities. The first, which I'm going to talk about today, is Citizens First, and the Citizens First series of research, which we've done down for about 20 years. And we also do a Business First equivalent type survey as well, and I'll touch on that. We also provide training. We offer certification in service professional and service management areas, which is basically aimed at the professionalization of the public service. And we manage, probably most importantly, 2 key councils in the Canadian context that are made up of representatives from all levels of government. And one council deals with service delivery issues, and the other one looks at information technology and enabling technologies, and we manage that whole process. So what I'm going to do today is take you through the latest iteration of Citizens First 8. I'm going to explain to you some of the concepts behind this study and why it matters and why we've been doing this for 20 years. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I don't know why this keeps jumping, I apologize. I'll give you the background. Is there any way you guys can stop that from moving forward? Let me just put this down. Okay. I'll skip that. It wants me to present this slide. So we have undertaken these studies now for the last, I apologize, I don't know why this is. Do you guys know why it's, I'm not even touching it. It's like it has its own mind. See, it's going through by itself. Okay, maybe I'll ask you guys to click it through from there. Is that okay? It'll be easier. Okay, so if you back up, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to give you the background and approach. We're going to look at the key findings. See, it's not me. Yeah, maybe don't move it. Let them in the background. Just use the laptop. Okay, so key findings. How are we doing? Priorities for improvement, service expectations, moving services online. Okay, next slide, please. So the objectives of this study. Basically, it's a way to measure levels of satisfaction with public services in Canada at all levels of government. Through these studies, we've identified the key drivers of satisfaction. I'm going to speak to that. We've identified channel preferences, in other words, which channels citizens prefer to use to interact with government, expectations around the services they receive in terms of standards, timeliness, et cetera, and then ways to basically increase the uptake of digital government or online services. Next slide, please. So we did make changes to Citizens First 8 like we have since the very first one. And we continue to refine and improve the methodology. And I'll talk to our client service index in a few slides. The other key thing about this iteration is that we introduced the use of behavioral science. We applied a lens to sort of get at some of the root causes more from a psychological, behavioral aspect in terms of satisfaction. Next slide, please. So here you can see basically, and if I had the clicker, I would scroll it across here, but you can see all the different versions of Citizens First that we've done over the last 20 years. And what I want to point out is that way back in 1998, when we were given the responsibility to carry out this work on behalf of governments in Canada, it really started off as a performance measurement and benchmarking tool or exercise, up to today where we're looking at it from a behavioral science perspective. Next slide, please. So this is a map of Canada for those that weren't sure. And you can see in the kind of orange color, those are all the provinces, territories, the jurisdictions that participate in this study. The light blue ones, unfortunately, they did not take part in this study. Next slide, please. So our approach to the study was basically mixed methodology, which in essence means that it was a combination of using online, telephone, and mail back. And the reason for that is this is a fairly significant sample size. There's over 5,000 respondents to this study. It involved residents across Canada. And we undertook the survey basically in December of 2017 until February 2018. Okay, next slide, please. So key findings. Next slide. So I'm not going to go through all of these right now because we'll talk about them in the upcoming slides. But basically what we learned is that for the most part, Canadians are content with the level, quality, and are satisfied with the services they receive from government. However, there are important or key areas that still continue to impact levels of satisfaction. And they predominantly pertain to issue resolution. So when you encounter a problem or a challenge and you can't get the answer or the service you're looking for. There's still issues around timeliness, timely help, and of course, governments in Canada still want to increase the use of digital government. Next slide, please. So how are we doing in Canada? Next slide. So one of the great things about doing a series of studies like Citizens First is that we have the ability to track over time just how we're performing. So you can see here from 1998 up until 2018 the different levels of government in Canada and their performance when it comes to service reputation. Okay? So it might be a little hard to see from there, but the blue is municipal, so that's city government. The gray is the federal government. The orange is regional, so that's a level just above municipal. And then the reddish line is provincial government. What you see here basically is a steady rise in overall levels of service reputation. And what this means is that Canadians since 1998 for the most part, and I'll speak to 2008 specifically, have increasingly basically felt that the overall service of government, its reputation as a service provider, has gotten better for the most part. 2008, does anyone know what 2008 represents? That's right. So the impact of the financial crisis had a direct hit on the reputation of government services. Why, do you ask? Because of confidence and trust. One of the key underlying pieces of Citizens First, our research, is that it has demonstrated that there is a strong correlation between levels of satisfaction, internal employment or employee engagement, in other words, people believing and understanding the vision, the mission, what it is they need to achieve, and ultimately trust and confidence in public institutions. How I translate that is basically if a citizen feels that they are not getting the best service, if they feel that it's not transparent, there isn't accountability, they have difficulty interacting with government officials, their confidence declines in all public institutions. And that has been proven in Canada. And in fact, we've seen studies where if government or service employees are engaged, they're happy, they understand their role, they're contributing, that can lead to a 1% increase in terms of employee satisfaction, which has an increase of 2% in overall levels of satisfaction among citizens. So there's a very strong relationship. We call that the service value chain, which is borrowed from the private sector. Next slide, please. So here what we have basically is the breakdown by levels of government in terms of those reputation scores. So you can see that the federal government has the lowest score of 58, whereas municipal has a score of 64. Can anyone sort of guess as to why that might be? That would suggest you're specialists in Canadian politics or administration. Really what that represents is the fact that for most people, the services provided by the federal government are not services they use every day. They don't interact with a lot of the services, or at least they don't see them, right? Of course, there's a lot of regulatory services, border services, food regulations, you name it. But typically you don't see that. On the other hand, at the city or municipal level, you feel and see those services almost every day. So in the Canadian context, for example, it snows in the winter. We get lots of it, snow removal. If your street is not plowed or cleaned, you feel that. If that service isn't provided in a timely fashion, it's going to impact you. So there's a stronger proximity, if you will, to municipal services, and therefore there's usually higher scores or inversely lower scores depending on the type of service. Next slide, please. So here's another interesting example of our ability to track over time, the last 20 years, overall service quality scores in terms of satisfaction with what we call a national basket of services. So what we've done here is we've grouped together services from the federal, provincial, and local governments that are representative of the services that a citizen would use. So again, what you can see here is from 1998 up until around 2014, fairly, not a steep rise, but a gradual increase. 2018, Citizens First 8, there's a slight dip. So while this is not statistically significant, to me, it may be worrisome. And the reason I say that is because when you look at the trend here, it's plateaued, okay? So when I speak to my Canadian colleagues and we talk about various initiatives that have happened over the years, around 2005, the federal government and a number of provincial governments had invested enormously in moving services online, okay? But after 2005, governments became less interested with that type of work. It's not to say we didn't continue doing that, but we did less of it. There didn't seem to be as many service improvement initiatives or exercises or, service leadership type efforts. So you're starting to see a flat line, and that dip to me represents perhaps a troubling sign ahead. Next slide, please. So client satisfaction index. Next slide. So what we do to really sort of get to the core of levels of satisfaction is we combine three key sort of groups of questions, if you will, that relate to satisfaction, best service anywhere, and exceeded expectations, okay? When we put that together, that gives us an index to tell us how we are scoring. Next slide, please. So here, in Citizens First 8, the overall CSI, or Client Satisfaction Index score, was 63, which is a representation of those three. So in terms of satisfaction, the score was 70, but then when you got to exceeded my expectations, it was 59. So the average of that gives you 63. Not bad, but not great. Kind of like government. Sometimes, it's good, but not exceptional. Next slide, please. So when you look at channel usage and satisfaction, we compare Citizens First 8 and Citizens First 7, which was conducted in 2014. So for the office channel, you can see that although use of it has declined, the overall level of satisfaction is the highest with the Office channel. And again, some people say, well, why is that? Generally, from all the years of research we've done, it's because it's the human connection. You can try to take away offices, and I don't know what it's like in other parts of the world, but anytime in Canada a government tries to close down service centers, it is front page, it is the headlines, it's on all the media. People want to interact with people, okay? Phone hasn't really changed in terms of usage. Website, likewise. The levels of satisfaction using the CSI are lower. Phone has always been problematic and is still problematic. What that tells us is that we still haven't figured out how to provide good services using the phone channel. And there's many reasons for that. I don't have time to get into that today, but it is still very problematic. Next slide, please. So ratings of service attributes. Next slide. So what we do here is we actually look at different attributes related to services, okay, and we measure that. So in this case, because Canada is a bilingual country, English and French, official language or the ability to receive the service in either official language is very important. And fortunately for Canada, our score is pretty good. It's at 84 out of 100. So that basically says that most Canadians feel that they can get services from government in their official language, which is a good thing, because it really matters. And then you can see some of the other ones here. I won't spend too much time, but generally, all fairly good scores on these attributes. Next slide, please. Likewise, we have preferred channel, ease of access, timeliness, future issues, timely help, and issue resolution. This slide's very important, and I know it must be a little difficult to see there, and I don't have the clicker to point out. There's 3 attributes I want to point out to you where there's a red triangle. Timeliness. So in Citizens First 7, it was at around 76, a score 76. Citizens First 8, that dropped to 71. That's statistically significant. Timely help, 70. It dropped from 76 from 4 years ago. And issue resolution, down to 45 from 68. So if I really wanted to panic and get government executives and leaders in Canada all excited, I would say, guys, you're doing a terrible job. The truth is, we're not sure yet if this is one of 2 things or a combination. One is the service levels have actually dropped in those with regard to those attributes, which is quite possible. So service standards, timeliness, the ability of you to get the service and the response that you're looking for the first time around, all of those may have dropped. Or expectations in terms of the level of services that citizens expect from governments has completely outgrown what it used to be. And what I mean by that, it's the digital world. It's the Amazons, right? It's the experience that you get as a consumer, right? So we know that there's a growing gap, and I have another slide or 2 that will illustrate that. But to me, again, that's an early warning sign that we need to pay attention to. Next slide, please. So these are some additional attributes, and these are more around the actual staff or the individual providing the service. And again, when it comes to that, you can see for the most part, scores are comparable from CF7 to CF8. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yep, thank you. So these are attributes related to the different channels. I won't go through all of them, but again, here, the good news is there's nothing significantly different in terms of where we were 4 years ago. So for the most part, we seem to be doing well on these. Next slide. So priorities for improvement. So one of the things that's really important about the work we do is it's not just research for the sake of research, but it's actionable research. It's insightful, right? So what we do is identify the key drivers that have an impact on levels of satisfaction, okay? So we use a simple importance performance matrix to do this. The upper left-hand corner are the most important drivers because basically they have a high impact in terms of satisfaction and the scores are low. Whereas the other ones are protect quadrant, monitor, maintain. So we want to focus on that top left-hand quadrant. So what are the key drivers in the Canadian context for service? What do Canadians basically want? They want services that fix their problem. That's what they want. Issue resolution. I have a problem, help me solve it. Get me the information, get me this permit, get me this card, this service, whatever program. Future issues, make sure I don't have any problems going forward. Tell me what I need to know, help me right now so I don't have to come back to you again with another problem related to the one I had in the first place. These are key. Timely help. That basically means that if I get stuck, especially if I'm online or on, working on government website, and I can't find something, I can get a hold of someone either on the phone or text or chat. Timely help. Extra mile, all that means is they did it with a smile. They were actually happy to see you today. It made you feel good. It's that emotional side of the interaction, right? And then telephone. Telephone, that channel has been an irritant for a long, long time, but Canadians still want to be able to call someone and actually talk to someone who can help them. Okay, next slide, please. So again, a summary of the key drivers, they're all there. And then it's from those drivers that we then get right down into specifics at a program level. So service expectations. This is my favorite part of the study. Next slide, please. So if you look at the gold bars versus the blue bars, what that is basically the experience that a Canadian citizen has with the service channel, and their expectation is in blue. So you can see for time spent waiting at an office, it's almost the same. Oh, is it working now? It was the battery, I bet, right? That's what I thought. Okay, so let's try this. So you can see here the blue. So 20 minutes is kind of the expectation of being in an office to get government services. The actual experience is 19 minutes, so that's pretty good, pretty close. Here's where it gets fun. Time spent on the telephone, 17 minutes. Canadians think they shouldn't spend any more than 7 minutes on a phone dealing with a government employee for whatever service. Here's where it's even more of a gap. Online. Average time spent is about 14 minutes. 14 minutes. Who spends 14 minutes on a website or an app going around and around? They expect that in 5. This has been dropping. That gap has been growing, right? And again, earlier when I said which one is it the standards, quality, is it dropping, or our expectations, are they just on the rise continually, right?
Can we wrap up?
Yeah. Okay, so I won't spend too much more time. This just shows you basically how satisfaction drops the longer you're on a channel. Phone is the worst, web isn't too bad. Number of channels used, obviously, again, straightforward. The more channels you have to use to get that service or that interaction, satisfaction tends to drop. So I'll briefly talk about this. This was added to the study for the first time. We added a behavioral science lens to our analysis, which basically was focused on helping us better understand how to get more Canadians to use government services online. So in this model, what we did is basically identified the 2 key sort of components, if you will, for nudging, I guess, motivating, encouraging. And it comes down to basically reflective, which is humans being rational and thinking. something through as opposed to just automatically responding, and psychological ability. So what does that really mean? So what it means basically is that Canadians are willing to consume more government services online if there's ease and confidence in the website, the application, and online support. To do that, it requires more education, more persuasion, and in some cases, coercion. There's also a need for citizens to feel knowledgeable in using whatever service in that service design. What that means basically is that if Canadians are comfortable and they understand how that service is being offered online, they will use it, right? We've got a lot more work to do here, but this is critical in the Canadian context because of our push towards digital government. Okay.
The time is almost.
It's all done. So I'll just conclude then by saying that, again, this study is an enormous study, enormous undertaking. But at the end of the day, and I'll go right to the end here, what it tells us is that governments have to continually improve. It's not good enough to sort of get to a certain point and say, well, that's as good as it's going to get. That's why we do these studies. That's why we work with governments across Canada. That's why we've been doing it for 20 years. And that's the journey that we're on. And the ICCS is a big part of that. And I hope you've enjoyed the brief overview of Citizens First.
Thank you very much. Although we are running out of time, but we'll take one question. Maybe if anyone has any question.
Or they can ask me after if they want.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
I just noticed that in one of the slides, you had like the average best when it comes for benchmarking or comparison basis. Could you shed a light on the if there was any benchmarking, whether with North America, the rest of the world, anything just for understanding?
Sure. So you're talking about the best in class?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I didn't mention at the start, basically Citizens First is two studies. What I presented is the national study, so it's the overview, okay? Then we have what are called jurisdictional studies. So every jurisdiction that participates as a partner in the study also has basically respondents or a sample size reflective of that, the size of that jurisdiction. So the best in class is basically benchmarking within all the participants, so all the subscribers. So we don't identify it here because obviously we don't want to tell you that British Columbia was better than Ontario, it was better than Alberta, but that's where the benchmarking comes from. So each jurisdiction then is benchmarked and we measure against that. So that's why you have the national and the best in class for the jurisdiction.
So does this mean there was no international benchmark?
Not for these studies. This is all in the Canadian context. But having said that, we do license CF in Singapore, and it has been licensed in New Zealand, but we have not taken those benchmarks and brought it into the study.
Okay, the last question again. Were any objectives set, like in the UAE, for example, we know when it comes to government services, there is an average, whether for Dubai, Abu Dhabi, other Emirates, or the federal government services. Yep. Is there something like that in Canada?
In terms of the CSI or any of the key measurements?
Yes.
No, we don't set the sort of the benchmark for where government should be at. That's up to each jurisdiction to determine whether or not that's where they think they ought to be. So, I mean, what we do is we work with them and say, you know, this is a comparable where you ought to be, but we don't set them. We let governments do that.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Dan.